Hello, and welcome to my lecture on PHP, MySQL, and PDO. This lecture, audio, video, are copyright Creative Commons, as well as the slides. And so this is the moment where we kind of cross the streams a bit, where we learned PHP first, kind of as a programming language, and then we learned SQL as kind of a programming language. And now we're going to write our first PHP program that has SQL in it. And so if you look back at what we were doing before, we were playing with PHP-MyAdmin, and we were functioning as the database administrator. So we would sit out here, and we type commands to the PHP-MyAdmin code. Those commands would turn into SQL commands that would go to the database. Database would change its stuff or whatever, and we would view it. So that's how you do. And when you have these applications, you will still function as a database administrator to create tables and do this, that, and the other thing. And so this is an important role. But that's not the role we're going to be in now. What we're going to be in now is we're going to be in the role of the application. So this is the PHP code, right? The PHP code is our application, and we're now the developer, and we're going to start writing this application. And in there are going to be SQL commands that will be sent across what's called a connection, and then our data will come back. And then we'll produce HTML coming out. So the user, we're going to click something on a web screen. Our PHP will make a connection to the database, send the commands, select, all that to the database. It'll do its thing, and then the data will come back. We'll turn that back into HTML, and away we go. So we're going to be, this is us now. We're writing this PHP code that knows how to talk to the database. So first thing we're going to learn is how to make this connection, and then we're going to learn about how to send commands down that connection. So if you look around, and you can just say, what's the best way to access SQL in PHP? And you will get lots of people to argue with you. If you recall all the way back to the Rasmus Leerdorf interview, he talks about how PHP likes having things working. And so the original MySQL _routines were there. They connected only to the MySQL database, and they had their advantages and disadvantages. But PHP is increasingly moving towards kind of an object-oriented pattern, which allows a lot more flexibility. There's a lot of nice things. And so this MySQL and I don't want you to use it at all in this class. They're all deprecated, even though they will work for a long time. They have lots of problems. I don't even want to teach you what the problems are. And then there are two object-oriented approaches. One is a thing called MySQLi, and when I was switching, I played with both, and I really don't like this one either. It has all the flaws of the original one, so I don't like that. So PDO, and it's a perfect topic to debate, but in this class, I'm using PDO. PDO has lots of advantages. One of the advantages that it's claimed is that it can talk to more than one database, and that's fine, but there's enough pain in that I think that's actually not its valuable thing. I just think it is a better way, a more elegant way to talk to the database. And to the extent that I have built applications, I've used all three of these approaches, and PDO is the one that I really prefer. It just is cleaner, it's less brittle, code makes more sense. But go to Stack Overflow and argue if you like. So this just gives a little bit of a sense of how you would do the same thing, how you would basically make a connection with this is the MySQLi. These two are the PDO is the one that I like. These two are the object-oriented ones, and this is the old one. So if you recognize this, if you've had other classes, you've probably done this, right? And you'll be able to do this for a long time, but I just think it's a shame to teach you this stuff. And so there's a series of _____. They all were prefixed. That's kind of an indication you should use an object-oriented pattern. So this, like new MySQLi, is an object-oriented pattern, and then instead you're calling methods within that object, and that's fine. That's great, except that I don't like some of the things that you do in here, and it's too long to explain. And so this is the one I like, right? It's an object-oriented pattern where you create the database connection with a user and a password, and then you run these queries, and away you go, right? Okay, so this is a nice way to do it. And it has a lot of things we like about it. So I think I'll stop talking about that now. Okay, so The first thing, which we've already done, is we're going to create a database. Now remember that a database has many tables. So I'll use this in the next couple of examples. I'll create a database called miscellaneous, and then I'm going to create a database user. This is the user that actually allows us to do our connection to the database. Okay, so let me do that. So I'm going to use PHP-MyAdmin on this one. So here I have my PHP-MyAdmin. Here I have databases. I don't have a MISC database. If I want to get rid of it, I would just say drop. So I'm just going to create a new database, and I'm going to call it MISC. Create. Done. So now I have a MISC database. There we go. Okay. Now I'm going to do some SQL, and I'm going to create this user. So this user is a user and password. And this is not like data in a table. This is actually a way to say this is the ID and password that I'm going to use to connect to the database. Now, if you are using cPanel, you might not be able to run this command. You may have to actually go into cPanel, get your thing created, or maybe you even have been told what your database ID and password are. One way or the other, you get this information. If you're like the super user where you just made the database and you have all the power, this is what you do. Otherwise, these two pieces of information, Fred and Zap in my current example, would be handed to you, or maybe one is handed to you and get to set the other. But one way or the other, you've got to get to the point where you've got a database, an ID, and a password. And that is how you make a database connection. So if I still look at MISC, there are no tables. There's no tables in this database. I simply have a database and then like a way in to make this database connection. So now I'm going to want to create a table. And I'm just going to copy both of these because they can conveniently have a semicolon at the end of them. And I'm going to create my first table. And I say go. And I'll hit refresh. And so now I have a table with users. It's an auto increment. I put an index on it, yada yada. We've done that before. So we're still just being a database administrator. Okay? So now that we're a database administrator, we have a table. And we're still going to do the database administrator inserting of a few records. So I'll put those guys in there. They got semicolons, so I can do them all in the same click. So now I've got those in, and I put the data in. So now I do a browse, and son of a gun, if I got Tooth, I got Chuck, and Glenn. So there we go. So now that we've got all this set up, I put some data in. We wouldn't have to put the data in, but I'm doing that DB admin. So now we're going to switch. We have got a database server running on a host. If it's on your desktop, it's the same host, but it could be on a different server. So you might actually have an address, an IP address that your ISP says, here's where your database lives, or a big ugly domain name. And in there are multiple databases, right? And so I have a database named MISC, and I have a database called Sakai. Sakai has a bunch of tables in it. And I have a table called users in MISC. Now I basically want to connect my PHP up to that. And so this is where I need, as an executable statement in my PHP, I have to run a line like this. Okay? And so I'm going to grab a database connection, Pdo. This is creating an object of type Pdo and passing 3 parameters. The first parameter is what's called a connection string. And this tells what host it's on. In this case, it's localhost because I'm running a developer. What port it's on. The default port is 3306. I'm using MAMP, and my SQL server is the port. This is the port right here. So is that 3306 or is that 8889? Mine happens to be MAMP. And then, so that's the big first, and the database name also is indicating which database you want among all the databases. So that's all part of that connection string separated by colons. You'll get this working once, and then your ID and your password. So this has 3 parameters, parameter 1, parameter 2, and parameter 3. And you give back this database object that allows you to do things with that. And that is a connection. The connection is effectively this side of it, right? So this $db variable is your variable that allows you to access this SQL connection. Now this might blow up. It might fail if there's no database. It might fail if these are the wrong passwords. There's lots of ways for this to fail. But if it succeeds, then you get this. It's like a file handle to open a file, but it's like a database handle to open a database. We call it a database connection. And so here we go. We're going to write a bit of code. I'm going to echo. We're going to make the database connection. We are going to do a Pdo query. And so this is taking this little Pdo guy and running a query. So this is just a string of SQL, no different than the SQL we typed into PHP-MyAdmin and been doing so for a while. And now I have a little while loop that's going to go and do statement fetch. Statement is what comes back from this Pdo query. Okay. Pdo fetch associative says give me this as a set of key value pairs on a row by row basis, where the column are the key and the rows are the values. I'm going to do that until that becomes false and then print it out. So there are two records, and so I'm getting in my PHP code an array with ID mapped to 1, name mapped to Chuck, email mapped to CSEV, which is that first record, and then the second record comes out. So now I have a way of effectively doing a select statement and then doing something parsing through. Now we'll do something more clever than this, but this is a good time to stop and understand every single line of this, right? Make a database connection. Run a query on that connection. Retrieve the results of that query in a loop. Sometimes you'll only pull one row, sometimes you'll pull multiple rows. And each row is a key value array that represents the row. And the key is the title and the value is the data in the row. It's pretty simple, but look at it closely. Understand every single bit of it. Okay. So, and you can run this. Let's run it here. Oops. Clear that. Go back to pointer. Oh, while you're at it, if this is there, run it. It checks a couple of settings, and it'll yell at you if it's not happy with your settings. But I got my settings right, so it's happy with me. But if I go to this first guy, that's what ran. That's the output. That's the print R of the first row of my database and a print R of the second row of my database. So we've now crossed the streams. We've got to the point where this thing comes out. Okay? So you generally don't use print R. So you usually, if you saw my picture, I said then you take the data and then you do something with HTML. And so now what you'll see me doing is you'll see me, I'm going to echo a table command, the start of a table row TD, then echo the row data, and the end of a table data, start of a new table data. And so I'm constructing the table, and then the TRs are each row, and then the TDs are each of the things that are in here. And so I'm actually just pulling the name, email, and password, which was the name, email, and password, which were the columns that I asked for. And so, this part up here is pretty much exactly the same I did before, but now instead of just doing a print R in a pre-tag, I'm actually creating HTML. And so you can see the HTML that's generated. It's got the name, got the email, and 123. And the browser renders that as a table. Oops. Simple enough. Okay, so that is reading it and then producing HTML as a result. We'll be doing this a lot. So there's the notion of putting the database password in the actual file that's running your PHP. That's generally a bad idea, and so we tend to use an include to put the database file in database connection all by itself in a file. So I'd refactor that previous code to basically be a file. Oops. To be one file called, I'll call it pdo.php, and then in that I just create the PDO, and I'm going to set an attribute in here. We'll talk about this later. I want it to throw an exception to basically blow up if I make any errors, and so that's just a good way, especially when we're first getting started, so that you can catch your errors. Okay, so then we have this file, and this file actually produces no output, but it does, as a side effect, create this variable called PDO that is that database connection. Okay, and so here we go in my little program, and in the third now I say it's echo pre, and then I require this file, which just pulls it in. The difference is now I can have lots of files that look like this. And then I do a query, and then I do the little fetch row, and then I print it out. So the only pattern here is we took what was the database setup and pulled it out into a separate file, and then we pull it back in with an include file. Okay? So this pattern that we have one of these, and then over and over and over we do this, is a very, very common and important pattern, because you don't want to lose track of that data, and you don't want to be changing it in 40 files. So that was a select. Let's actually stick some data in the database. So if you think about it, let me just show you how this one works. So we'll call this guy user1. Oops. Call this guy user1. Okay. So it's a post form, and I go Fred at umich.edu, and a password of something, and add new. And so then it does an insert, and it gives me another post form. And if I look at my data here, and I do a browse, you see that there's a new record there. So how did that happen? Well, here's a bit of post code. We've been playing with this post code. This is not quite my little model view controller pattern, because it does do a little bit of output here. Okay, so we type this in, and then we hit submit. So the first time through, it just falls through because there's no post data, and it prints out the form. Right, so the form comes out, and that's the first time through. And then we hit the post button so that there's some post data, and so now that means this if statement runs. And so if these three things are set in the post data, we're going to do an insert. So we're going to say insert into users. This looks like SQL we've been doing. Values equal. Now this little colon name, colon email, and colon password, these are placeholders in this values, where we're going to actually take the strings from the input data and insert them. Okay, so that's our SQL. I have an echo statement, which is sort of a violation of my model view controller. And then I do what's called prepare, and I pass that string in. And that's really just a string of SQL, and it has placeholders for those little values that I'm supposed to put in there. Okay, and then after that works, then I get this thing called a statement back, and then I execute, call the execute method on that statement, and I pass into it an array that has key value pairs, where the key corresponds to each one of these placeholders. You got to have one for each of the placeholders. So if you have three placeholders and they're named this, and you don't have three keys, you're going to be in trouble. And then the value is actually just the string that we want to put in the value. So this is basically saying take the post data for name, stick it as the first value, take the post data for email, stick it as the second value, take the post data for password, and stick it as the third value. So it's like sticking the actual Fred here, csev here, and password here. Okay, and then we execute it, and that runs it, doing the substitutions as appropriate. And because I have this little echo statement, you can see the actual SQL that's being executed. Okay, so that's the actual SQL that's being executed. We may want to make it so that we actually see the data, so we don't have to use PHP-MyAdmin to see the data. So in user 2, the way it works is, in user 2, it does a select and prints out the table. And then if I add a new user, it adds it, and it does this echo, and it selects all of them and then prints out the table. So this pretty much is exactly the same application, except this stuff is coming out differently. And so you can see the only thing really that's different here is this is the same, this is the same. The only difference is that before I print out the form, I have that loop from a previous program, select name, email, and password from users, then I loop through fetching, and that produces this table. So now I have this is kind of like a view. Yuck. This is the view. This is the add form, and every time I hit it, I get to see the new screen. So that's not too hard to do. So you see this pattern of sort of handle the silent stuff. It's not fully silent because of this line yet. Start the view, show some stuff, and then down here we have the form that we had before. Okay? So we don't have to just do insert statements. We can do a delete statement. So I'm going to do this user2del, and you'll basically see that on the GET request it follows through and puts out a form that has a variable that's ID, and then a submit.delete. And if then it comes back in, this time it deletes it. Delete from users where ID equals :zip. And that is going to be this value here. We print it, we prepare it, and then we map zip to $post_ID, which is that variable right there. And so we delete whatever one is there. Okay, so that's user2del.php. We have to remember what these IDs are. So hang on. Let's take a look at this. And so this ID, Chuck Glenn, let's get rid of 3. User2del.php. So I want to delete user3. Okay, and I will delete that. And it deletes from users where ID equals :zip. :zip was that number. And if I rebrowse, then you can see that ID3 is gone. So I was able to, in effect, a delete statement inside of my PHP as well. So you see the pattern here. We do this prepare. We put these little placeholders in. Oops. We put these prepare. We do the placeholders. We map the placeholders from post data, and away we go. Okay. So whatever it is that we want to do, we can run these with this simple sort of two-step statement. Okay. So now we're going to show you how you can kind of combine this delete operation with the table. Okay. And so basically we're going to add a column here and a little delete button to go and do the delete. So let me show you how this works. We're going to add in the table. So if you take a look at the table has the name, the email, and the password. We got that. We're going to add this little chunk right here. And we're going to actually put right inside of this a form. Method equals post, input type equals hidden, and we're going to call it an ID value, which is the value of the row's ID. So this is going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the actual row's ID. And then we're going to make a button with the value of del and a name of delete. And so later down there's the add form, but this is a form that is in every one of those rows, right? It was that last column. It's these guys are little mini forms with little mini buttons in them. And then there's another form down here at the bottom, which is the add form. We can tell, if we name the button right, we can tell there's actually 4 forms here, 2, 3, 4, 5 forms. And we can tell, oh, if this is $post sub delete, well, that means that the delete button was post, and we have the ID. And so we get if one of these little forms gets pushed, we're going to get both a delete item and an ID item. And so then what we do is we just say delete from users where ID equals zip, and we'll just pull in the post data right here, and then we delete that thing, and away we go. And we'll see the SQL that comes out. So let's play with that one a bit. So here's our user 3. Let's add one, Fred, and fred@umich.edu, and a password of some type. So we'll add one. That's kind of code we've showed before. But now, if I do a quick inspect element on this guy right here, this right here is a form. It has a hidden variable that you can't see with a number 1, because that's the row for Chuck is 1, right? And then a submit button, and that's what this button is with a name and delete. And if I go down to the next row, the second row, and I look at the little form for Glenn, I see the hidden ID value of 2 and then a delete button. Okay? So I carefully constructed this in my code that made this. So I've got all these rows, and here's Fred. Poor Fred, we're going to delete him in a second. He's got an ID of 6 and a name equals delete. So we're going to hit that. So that's going to be a post, right? And so it did a delete. Now we're not doing a redirect, so the last thing we want to do is hit refresh. Oh, I will hit refresh. And that says, oh, do you want to delete that guy again? Now he's gone, so we can't. It would delete 6 again. But this is a perfect example of why you don't want to do output to a post. But I'm cheating because I actually want to print this out. But in a second, we're going to make that silent and switch back to post redirect. But I'm temporarily suspending post redirect just so you can kind of see what's going on. But after you know what's going on, we'll go back to post redirect because that's the way it ought to work. Okay, and so I sort of showed you all this stuff. You know, the ID value there, the ID value comes from the row itself, and then the name equals delete is the thing that triggers us to process this when we press that. We make sure that that has not got a name of delete, right? So that's how we have these little forms. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 little forms. The only difference is the ID on there is the ID number changes on each of these forms. So not only can we tell that a delete button was pressed, but we can say which delete button was pressed from this ID data. And of course we print this out and we see this. It's really taking data from post ID instead of :zip. And away we go. Showed you that already. Okay, so if we take a look at the overall program outline of this thing, we've got sort of the silent part, other than the fact that these 2 lines probably shouldn't be there. Oops, not that one. Not that one. That one needs to be there. This echo statement and this echo statement. That's kind of cheap. So we don't want to do that. But we sort of have the silent part where we're handling incoming post data. It's kind of similar to that. We have sort of the showing part of it where we're reading through the rows, and then we have the part that has the add code, and that has the input and the value of new and all that stuff. Okay, so that's the basic program outline.